In most of our videos here, we are interested in the changes between Latin and modern Romance. And while those are super interesting, I think I'm in danger of misrepresenting the situation. You see, change between Latin and Romance isn't the principal phenomenon. It's not the baseline state of affairs. Rather, all that change actually takes place in an overall environment of continuity. The Romance languages are a lot more like Latin than they are not like Latin, if you permit the rather strange comparison. They come from Latin, and perhaps a good way of thinking of them is that the Romance languages, whatever they are actually really the Latin language as spoken in certain places and under certain conditions today in the 21st century. They may have different names, and they may actually be separate languages if we compare two different historical snapshots. If we compare French as spoken in the 1990s to Latin as spoken by Cicero in Rome in the 1st century AD. But the comparison between these two snapshots, which is a lot of what we do here, shouldn't lead us to ignore the fact that we're talking about a language continuum across time here. And today, I want to somewhat remedy this tendency in our videos by looking at something that has hardly changed between Latin and modern Romance. And those are syllables in stressed vowels. In Latin, every word had a stressed syllable. And those stressed syllables could be considered almost as the core of the word, the part that all the other parts are sort of ancillary to. And for all the changes that Latin underwent between the 1st century BC and the 20th century, stressed syllables have remained remarkably intact. The stress in Latin words is largely governed by what is known as the penult rule. That is to say, that stress tended to be on the penultimate syllable when that syllable had a long vowel. Of course, remember that Latin had this very important distinction between short and long vowels that has largely disappeared in the modern Romance languages. If the penultimate syllable was a long vowel, it would carry the stress. And that's what we see in words like amicus. In fact, that's one of the reasons that mi part is kept in all of the Romance variations today. Consider amigo in Spanish, amigo in Portuguese, amico in Italian, ami in French, for example. However, there is an exception to the penult rule, because in instances when the penultimate syllable has a short vowel, the tendency is that the stress moves to the antepenultimate syllable. And that's what happens in a word like dominus. The penult mi is short and open, and so it tends to not be stressed, and the stress falls on the o in dominus. This might actually be why, for example, Spanish dueño, which is the inherited form, completely loses that syllable mi. Here are some more examples of where modern Romance languages have perfectly conserved the stressed syllable in Latin words. For example, the Latin word for husband, maritus, you will know in Spanish is marido, in Portuguese, marido. And I believe something similar like marido in Catalan, correct me if I'm wrong there though. Italian has marito, French conserves mari, and Occitan has the very interesting mari. Now, I don't know how that would be pronounced. I don't know if you pronounce the final consonant in Occitan. Would this be marit? I'd be interested to hear from you below if you know. But I just thought it's at least worth putting in here for the sake of keeping my example as comprehensive as is reasonably possible. Another example of a word that conserves its stressed vowel perfectly is familia in Latin, which becomes familia in Italian, familia in Spanish, familia in Portuguese, and famille in French. And if I were to break frame for a moment and look at the way Latin has changed into modern Romance, it's not coincidental that a lot of the syllable changes and vowel changes that we see between Latin and modern Romance occur on unstressed syllables. So this, for example, is the case with a lot of syncope, which we've looked at in a previous video if you want to check that out on our channel. The unstressed open vowel e in Latin aperire doesn't by pure chance become abrir in Spanish and aprire in Italian. Likewise, that ubiquitous elision of the final consonant or us for masculine and neuter nouns in Latin becoming o usually in Romance languages, is another example of a change in an unstressed syllable. Populum is pueblo in Spanish, populo in Italian, status in Latin, estado, stato, eta, etc., etc. It is important to note that there are situations in which the stressed syllable does change in Latin. It's not perfectly conserved in the Romance languages, but those do tend to have quite systemic, understandable changes. So, for example, systemic diphthongization that occurs when Spanish adapts stressed short vowels in Latin, like, for example, terra becoming tierra, or portam becoming puerta. These are cases where we do see the change in a stressed syllable, but as some linguists and philologists point out, it actually seems to come from a desire from the speakers to conserve and pass on that emphasis, that stress that was present in Latin. Now, you might be asking, why make this video when there are so many other interesting videos I could make and that are coming down the pipeline? Well, I think the important thing is that it demonstrates a core problem in linguistics. And I don't mean a problem in the negative sense of something that ought to be overcome, but rather a core question, a matter at hand. And that's the interaction between minds and sounds. I might be becoming a little bit metaphysical here, but there's nothing intrinsic in stress that forces us as speakers to conserve it with the degree of reliability that we have in Romance languages. We produce sounds through our articulatory mechanisms, but it's our minds collectively that graft onto those sounds some kind of meaning. There's this really strange way in which a community of speakers seems to collectively, automatically, and unconsciously decide that this stress, this part that we emphasize in the word, grants it its central importance. Roman Jakobson, the famous Russian linguist, has actually written quite a lot about the importance of stress, how it applies to literature and poetry, but also how language seems to be structured around this contrast between stressed and unstressed syllables. And I think what makes this particularly interesting is that this isn't the sort of phenomenon that can be reduced to a simple cause and effect relationship. We're faced with a sort of chicken and egg situation. What came first? How on earth did we even get to the point of assigning stress to certain syllables? It's pretty easy to figure out that that generates a tightly coupled feedback mechanism as language develops, right? Speakers note stress in a particular syllable on the word, and therefore they're more likely to conserve stress, and that makes it more likely that future generations will conserve that stress, thus rendering the stress even more important. But how it arises in the first place is something I find absolutely fascinating. When we reach into these arcane regions of linguistics and psychology, is where the whole study of language becomes ethereal, but for that, all the more interesting. I just thought I would share this thought that's been on my mind over the last week or so. And I'm really keen to hear what you guys have to say. You often have quite insightful comments for me in the comment section. So let me know if you know of any particular theories you can direct me to that explain this remarkable staying power of stress in Romance languages, but in languages in general. I'm fascinated at that point where we seem to arrive almost at human constants in language. So I'll leave it till that and say, see you in the next video.